Diese Konferenz wird nun aufgezeichnet.
Hi everyone, apologies for the little delay we had. We just realized that my presentation is not fully visible, but we tested those of the speakers we have, and luckily this is working. So in case you have any technical troubles, please use the chat box and my colleagues will help with technical issues. So I would like to welcome you to our webinar. It's COP25, Making the Link, International Climate Policies and Their Local Impacts. This webinar is taking place within the Not Without Us project, which is working on bringing gender and climate advocates and activists to the climate negotiations. And we always aim to make the link actually between the local level and the international climate negotiations. As we all know, COP25 is just around the corner, and this is why we would like to organize this webinar to, making some links on what will be negotiated in the first 2 weeks of December, and to remind ourselves what it actually means for the people in this world. We could win several speakers that will go through topics that are negotiated in the climate conference. First of all, Erica Lennon from Ciel, who will tell us a little bit more about market approaches and their impact on local level, and how they are dealt with in the climate conferences. Then we will hand over to Tara Daniel from VDU, who has great insights into the Green Climate Fund, and will also explain on what is going on on the advocacy level, but also how much or in which way the projects and the finances have impacted the local level. After that, from Solidaritas Perempuan will tell us a little bit more about the situation of forestry and the climate negotiations in Indonesia. Oh, apologies. And last but not least, Isadora Cardoso from Unfccc will tell us a little bit more about the Gender Action Plan that is being renewed at this COP, and in which way also the sub-national level or national level can benefit from that. My name is Patricia Boland, and I'm working for Life, which is a German-based NGO working in particular on educational issues, but also on advocacy issues to strengthen gender and feminist views within climate policies in Germany, but also internationally. So I have already started a little bit to tell about the background of this webinar. What we are aiming at with several other activists and stakeholders that are also going to speak and maybe explain a little bit more about their background later, is that we aim at having a more human-centered climate talks. And we have started to discuss about these issues with local activists about 3 years ago, and started the Not Without Us project, which is kindly supported by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundations, and we are working together with 7 activists at the moment all over the world, and strengthening their advocacy on local level, but also an international level. And part of that is, of course, participating at the climate conferences yearly, and also in the intersessionals in Bonn. But what we often miss, of course, is the link of what is being discussed on the international level, and what is actually then happening and how it is impacting the local level. So I just wanted to show you a little bit about the terms and words that you can find on the website of the Unfccc at the moment that is guiding you to and on the conference that will take place in Madrid this year, but is the COP presidency is held by the Chilean government. And as you can see, there are a couple of different works, such as articles, a lot of numbers, of course, climate, Unfccc, but not so much about words like the climate crisis and the protests that are going on internationally. And we would like to look exactly in those topics during the webinar, and we very much hope that you as your audience will also get engaged in our discussion and maybe also can contribute with experiences from your countries and your local activities that are going on. So I would directly like to hand over to our first speaker, who is Erika, and let her tell a little bit more about what is going to be discussed on international level, on market mechanisms, and what has been so far the experience and impacts on the local level. Erika, if you're ready, you can unmute yourself, and I will hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Patricia. I'm assuming everyone can hear me. Yeah, so as Patricia mentioned, I will be talking a bit about sort of the market approaches, both what that means and then what the impacts are on the ground, and so what that sort of means for the negotiations themselves. So one of the main things that is still post-Katowice that's still left to be discussed under the implementation guidelines for the Paris Agreement are the rules and modalities and guidelines for Article 6, which are the market approaches and non-market mechanisms. And sort of collectively, that's how they're known. And really, essentially, they're ways of cooperating and ways for the parties to cooperate to, in theory, meet their commitments and reduce overall emissions of greenhouse gases. So if you look back at the Kyoto Protocol, the Kyoto Protocol had the clean development mechanism as one of the key market mechanisms for sort of meeting targets. But what you see with that is a history of both sort of undermining the ability to meet emissions targets as well as impacts on the ground. And so we don't want those to be repeated in the rules for Article 6. So one of the key, so there are a bunch of different sort of aspects of what's being negotiated around Article 6 and a lot of different layers. And so there's both sort of the discussion of a new sustainable development mechanism. There's some discussion of non-market approaches, though that discussion has advanced a little bit less than the other two, and then discussion of the internationally traded mitigation outcomes. And so one of the key aspects, sort of both for the rights and impacts of people and people on the ground, are that the rules for the markets need to make sure that they're not used to essentially undermine the integrity of the entire Paris Agreement. Because if what you're doing is having projects in, say, global South countries that are designed to reduce emissions or designed to be more clean energy projects that are then generating carbon credits that are bought by countries in the North that allows them to keep polluting, we're not necessarily going to reach overall mitigation of global emissions. And that's not going to help anyone meet the goal of getting to 1.5 degrees or staying well below 1.5 degrees, which we know is what we need. So a lot of the discussion around the market mechanisms is how to make sure to ensure that there's not double counting of emissions credits and to ensure that there's still environmental integrity, and so that there aren't these sort of loopholes that get around being able to reduce emissions. So that's sort of one aspect of markets and a big portion of it. And the other thing that we saw with the previous iterations of the market mechanisms and the clean development mechanism is that there were also really severe impacts on the ground and to local communities with some of these projects that were touted as quote unquote clean development. And so one of the other other key asks that we've been advocating for, and that women and gender constituency and other groups have been advocating for, is that really in the new rules for the Article 6 mechanisms is that there has to be a focus on human rights and establishment of social and environmental safeguards, ensuring that there's meaningful consultation at the local level with communities, and ensuring that there's an adequate avenue for grievance redress as sort of the pillars of how to ensure that local communities' rights are being respected and that they're not being harmed by projects that are essentially supposed to, in this new model, be sustainable development. So what we've seen in the past with clean development mechanisms is a number of projects that have not gone quite so right. So if you look at the example of one of the more prominent examples is the Barro Blanco Dam in Panama, which was a dam project. There was no consultation and no free, prior, and informed consent obtained from the local indigenous groups. It has led to flooding of their land, which has impacted their livelihoods, their cultural heritage, and a number of their human rights. Similarly, CL has been working alongside a group in Chile, and I'll touch a bit on what it means to have moved the COP as well from Santiago to Madrid based on this aspect. So one of the communities that we've been working with is a community that's been fighting against a run-of-the-river hydro project called Alto Maipo, which is along the Maipo River in the Cajon del Maipo, which provides a good portion of the water for Santiago. And this project has been funded by a number of financiers, but it has also been validated as a clean development mechanism project. And so getting that sort of validation and being like, yes, this is a clean project, can also help entice people to finance it and to pay for this. And what we've seen with our local partners on the ground is that there have been impacts. This has impacted their right to water because it's impacting how the river flows. And the river is also at lower levels because of climate change, naturally, and droughts. It's impacting their right to food. It's impacting their right to housing and adequate living conditions. There are a number of labor violations related to sort of housing and living conditions. One of the sort of towns in the middle of this construction site has basically been walled off because they're now living in the middle of a construction site. And so they've built these sort of walls around their town, which obviously impacts your ability to sort of interact with your environment. It impacts the right to a healthy environment. It impacts the right to cultural heritage because of artifacts in the area. And so these projects aren't really necessarily clean or sustainable if you look at it. And under the previous market mechanisms in the CDM, there were no rules about whether the projects had to comply with a set of sort of social and environmental safeguards or human rights norms or anything. And so parties now at this COP, as they're developing the rules for Article 6, should really learn from these past mistakes and really look at what has happened to communities on the ground by these so-called clean projects and realize that you shouldn't be able to sort of be benefiting and generating emissions reductions credits and be benefiting from sort of what you've deemed sustainable development if it doesn't sort of meet a common set of rights-based environmental and social safeguards, if there is no adequate and meaningful consultation with the local communities to make sure that they're involved in both the project design, but also that, if it's an indigenous people community, that you've obtained their free, prior, and informed consent. And then lastly, that there needs to be some sort of avenue for remedies so that even if you have in place safeguards, and even if you've consulted with communities, things can and do go wrong. And so part of respecting people's human rights is making sure that they have an avenue for seeking redress and remedy and justice. And so those are sort of three key elements that need to be embedded in the rules for Article 6 in order to ensure that local communities' rights are being respected and that they're not being harmed by what are supposed to be positive climate mitigation projects. And one of the, I'll just say one of the aspects of having moved this COP, it's hard to know, what the impacts of having moved the COP from Chile to Madrid will have sort of on the ultimate outcomes of the negotiations. But one of the things that it means is that the negotiators will end up being sort of divorced from the local realities of what's happening on the ground, at least in Chile, because instead of being able to be near, say, this CDM project and near this community that we've been working with, where you could see the impacts on their lives, they're going to be thousands of miles away. And in order for the community voices to be heard, they're going to have to travel thousands of miles to a different continent to, talk to people in the halls of the UNFCCC rather than it being sort of in their backyard, and also being able to bring people from the negotiations to see the realities on the ground, which is obviously a different level of being able to understand the impacts. And so I think that sort of is the gist of what's happening on markets, and I'm happy to answer questions, but I think one of the key things is to really think about, if we're designing rules for implementing the Paris Agreement and trying to come up with cooperative approaches to get to 1.5, if we're going to use these, we need to make sure that they don't undermine the overall goals, and they need to respect people's human rights, because otherwise it's sort of undermining the integrity of the Paris Agreement and the climate action that we know we need urgently, and that we want to see that, really puts people and local communities and women and indigenous communities and youth at the center. And so I think I am passing it on to either back to Patricia or on to Tara.
Thank you so much, Erica. I will quickly allow time if people directly have questions of understanding. If you have a bit broader questions later on, then we would just rather like to take them on later to make sure that all the presenters can keep their time. I would just like to add to Erica that it was a great presentation to understand what are actually the human relations or human rights relations from the Article 6, because the way it is currently negotiated is much more about the technical questions on how you actually calculate the emission reductions, or how you ensure that you have an overall emission reduced from the mechanism, for example, that is going to be established. And through those very technical, of course, important details, but rather technical questions, it often gets lost what it will actually mean later on the local level and on climate action that is going to happen. And it was a brilliant insight on how we will actually, or what we have experienced in the past, and how we can actually, what we can expect in the future to be seen on the ground, possibly, if it's not taking into account human rights safeguards, for example. And another comment is, I was asked if I forgot to click to the next slide, but Erica just presented without slides, so we will send around the recording later on, and you can just listen to what she said again. So thank you so much. I would now like to hand over to Tara, and it will take just a few seconds so that she can share her screen. Tara, I will pass on to you now.
Thank you so much, Patricia. So as we're pulling up my slides, you will see that we're going to be talking about the Green Climate Fund. So the first thing that I want to do is, sorry, I was just trying to go to full screen, is talk about what the Green Climate Fund is. It's an operating entity of the UNFCCC financial mechanism. And thus far, it's served over 100 countries, or will be serving once the funding is distributed, across 124 projects. There's a priority set for small island developing states, least developed countries, and African states, and you can see that distribution across these projects. And you might have heard a lot of about the GCF this year, because it's the first replenishment period. Since the initial resource mobilization, where nearly where over $10 billion was pledged, but not quite that much delivered. For this replenishment period thus far, nearly $10 billion has been raised to be distributed for the next 4 years. And there's also going to be hopefully more opportunities for advocacy to even increase that number during this period. What's going to be happening at COP with the GCF, one of the primary things is really the guidance to the operating entities of the financial mechanism. So the guidance that's issued at COP will reflect on what's happened with the GCF this year and provide direction on the priorities and policies and operations of the GCF. So this will be kind of an important point of really reflecting, particularly in this year of reflecting on the past 4 years of implementation of the GCF and looking toward this next 4-year period of really seeing what the parties are going to say that they want to see out of the GCF. Now, that's also going to be working in conjunction with lots of other things that are going on within the GCF's processes, such as its, strategic planning. A lot of the work that I'm going to be drawing from in the next few minutes emerges from a project that we had worked on jointly with both ends as a member of GAGA, really recognizing the importance when we're looking at this fund of building this capacity and knowledge at the local level, at the regional level, to really monitor these flows, to understand where the money is going across these 100 countries, these over 100 projects, and how we can directly participate and engage with the processes that are distributing these funds with the implementation of these projects. And so with the theme of this webinar, it really resonates with the work that has been done, in particular by our regional gender monitors. The first of whom I want to speak about is Maria Julia, who has been coordinating the Latin America Regional Gender Group, who has really recognized as part of her work the value that gender expertise can provide in reviewing the gender action plans, which are a standard part now of every single proposal that is coming before the Green Climate Fund to be implemented. So it's really an important and interesting space to be able to comment and provide feedback to the entities that are going to be implementing this project, as well as to the board members that are approving the projects about the strength of the gender action plan and the gender assessments in each of these proposals. So within this regional group, as well as all of the other regional gender groups, this is one of the activities that provides an avenue for our gender insights to help influence the way that these projects are ultimately implemented. So of course we have to work to strengthen the ways in which our voices are heard and the ways in which our analysis is taken up and recognized. Prior to this particular initiative, we had really recognized the value also of commenting on the full proposals, because we know that gender is not just something that can be relegated to an action plan or an assessment at the end of a proposal. And Shyla, who's now really involved with the Asia Pacific Regional Gender Group, had provided some of this detailed review on the first project that came up to the GCF a few years ago that was really specifically focused on the adaptation of women and girls. And this critique and analysis that Shyla, as well as others, provided really helped to ensure that there was greater stakeholder engagement and more consultation with civil society before this project was ultimately approved. And Shyla really recognizes in her work, as you can see in her quote, just the value of this engagement, not just in us building the ability of the GCF to implement gender responsive climate projects, but the capacity of women's organizations to partner with, to collaborate, to engage, to provide input into these projects can also be strengthened through these points of engagement. Wanan, who's been working also with the Asia Pacific Regional Group, has looked at another aspect of this engagement and really advocating for what should be happening at a national level and ensuring that civil society voices are truly heard in the ultimate process of taking a project from the concept, from the idea, all the way to approval by the board to disbursement of funds. A key part of that approval process is the National Designated Authority giving the green light, providing a no objection letter, and saying, yes, this project can move forward. So we're really excited about the work that Wanun's been leading in Thailand and the model that she's providing for the rest of the Asia Pacific regional group, as well as the other regional gender groups, on trying to figure out what an appropriate engaged civil society mechanism is for ensuring that that letter doesn't just mean that one person within a government bureaucracy has signed off on this proposal, but that the communities that are affected, that the civil society organizations with the insight into the proposal scope, into its impacts, into really what the ramifications of it are involved early on, so that our comments that we're ultimately making as civil society on the proposal aren't just coming at the point of approval, but much earlier in this pipeline of the projects, much earlier when they're being designed and conceptualized. TT, working with our Africa Regional Gender Group, which we have both an Anglophone and a Francophone aspect to that group, has recognized that through her attending this time, I think of at least 5 different board meetings, the value of really sharing the knowledge and the insight that she and the other gender monitors have gained from these board meetings into what this actually means for projects on the ground, because there's more to the GCF than looking at it on a project by project basis. Ultimately, these projects, how they are developed, how they are prioritized, how they are funded, is influenced and shaped by a complex set of policies that the GCF has developed. And there are so many opportunities for civil society to also analyze and reflect on what those policies are, and to try and provide input that we hope is taken up as these policies are ultimately adopted and implemented. So we really appreciate that ability to look at what's happening at these board meetings 3 times a year and really translating that into why it ultimately matters for future projects and for the current projects that are going to be funded with these billions of dollars. TT's really involved in advocating for understanding things like the readiness program, which is additional money that is available to countries not connected to a project, so that they can build their capacity for climate finance, because a huge part of building that capacity is building their ability to engage with the civil society organizations and activists working within their country. As we take this even further, we recognize that knowledge sharing is really important, but there is another level of really building capacity, and this entire initiative has demonstrated to us the importance of in-person meetings as we go through this, as Zinabu says, very complex set of policies and processes that are associated with the GCF. So really looking at the technical capacity of the ability to engage can require more in-person workshops and meetings. So we really want to look at how we can strengthen our ability to understand, as well as our ability to strategize and plan together, not just at an international level, as so many civil society activists are meeting prior to each board meeting and engaging at the board meetings themselves in a very international group, but how we can also have that process work on a national level and a regional level. And the regional gender groups do serve as a starting point for us to try and develop these mechanisms of collaboration. One of the questions that always comes up when we talk about gender in the GCF is really focused specifically on the GCF gender policy, which is important, but also recognizing again that every single project within the GCF needs to be gender responsive, and the other ways in which gender can come into many other policies, or should be coming into many other policies where the word gender isn't mentioned, is important. But we had hoped that because the GCF was really at its founding at the forefront of recognizing the importance of gender equality, that an updated version of the the gender policy and gender action plan would be forward looking and would be ambitious. Unfortunately, at the board meeting just this month, the policy that was adopted was not what we would hope for at all. It's incredibly disappointing, and there were many civil society inputs, and unfortunately, what we can do now is continue to look at implementation. This picture shows a guidance document that has been created by the GCF about mainstreaming gender. So we need to ensure that the policy we do have is followed fully, and continuing to recognize the ways in which we can contribute to and push forward the capacity building that really needs to happen, both on recognizing the importance of and implementing gender responsive implementation of these projects within these national designated authorities that are working at the country level, within all the entities that are ultimately the ones putting the projects forth and implementing them. And our standards won't change even if the GCF gender policy is a step backwards rather than a step forward. And just to close, because our next presentation is going to be on RED+, I wanted to touch on what's been happening within the GCF and RED+. There's a pilot program that has funded 4 different proposals for results-based payments based on different years of so-called results. There's also been a lot of criticism of the ways in which these results-based payments have been calculated, and just the continued existence and payment of this pilot. The Global Forest Coalition has been one of the key actors, particularly within the women and gender constituency, of looking at why these payments are so ill-advised and are not geared towards communities or sustainability. And here is a quote from a recent sign-on letter regarding the project in Paraguay, which was just approved for a payment of $50 million at this previous GCF meeting happening just a few weeks ago. So I'm sure the next presentation will delve into this further, but RED+ is definitely something that continues to come up and will continue to be, I think, a key thing that we're going to be watching closely within the GCF. So thank you overall for listening to this presentation, but I also wanted to provide the contact information of the different gender monitors that have participated in this initiative as we continue to try and translate what's happening at the GCF internationally to a regional level, so that you can reach out and become engaged in those regional gender groups if you so wish. For those of you coming to the upcoming COP, GCF is hosting 2 different side events. So I think they're, in addition to perhaps following what's happening with the guidance to the GCF, really COP is an opportunity to learn more about the GCF without going to a GCF meeting. So these side events can provide an opportunity for learning and exchange, in part because they're going to be attended by other civil society members that are closely following the GCF projects. You're also going to find most of the folks listed on this page at the Women and Gender Constituency morning meetings, and that's a great place to start with asking more questions about the GCF. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tara, for this great presentation and bringing us to the GCF a little bit closer. And I would just like to underline at that point the context you have just shared, because I'm pretty sure that all the regional people being already active on activities of that GCF are very happy about more allies taking closely care that the GCF is not an investing projects that are not helping to combat climate change or even worsening the situation of women and gender equality on the ground. So thank you very much. I would not give space for questions at that moment, because otherwise we might run out of time in the end. But I would really encourage you to type in your questions in the end, that we maybe have at least time for 2 to 3 questions that I can hand over then to the presenters. Thank you so much. And I have seen that Dinda could already share her screen, so I would like to hand over to Dinda now. Thank you so much, Dinda.
Thank you, Patricia, and hello, all. Nice to have this opportunity to share with you. As Erika and Tara already said that that it seems REDD+ will still be a center of discussions, including the Article 6 in the next COP. So I would like share some experiences and situations in Indonesia regarding the project. Okay, so talking about REDD, because before it wasn't REDD+, but it was REDD in Indonesia. Do you see my screen changing? No?
Just changed to white, actually.
Okay. So sorry. Because it said it's paused from here.
So you should be able to unpause it. I will just.
Okay.
Now we can see it again. Perfect.
Sorry. So it's began at 2008. It was a partnership between Indonesia and Australia, with the amount that you can see on the screen. That's the first agreement for the REDD in Indonesia. And we know that for the NDC commitment from Indonesia in 2030, Indonesia will reduce 29% or 41% with the help of the other countries, and the forestry still be the main sectors to meet the ambitions. So the government's plan to have like 96.6 million hectares of forest. It's including the REDD+ projects and also peatland. Okay, and one of the pilot project in Indonesia is Kalimantan Forest Climate Partnerships. It was begun at 2009, and it was conducted at Kapuas, Central Kalimantan, with the amount that you can see. That this area is considered as the most decent area in Indonesia that to conduct the pilot project of REDD, because of the governance and also the conditions of the forests and peatlands there, and also because they see that this area also quite supportive in terms of social and economic conditions. And this is the aim of the projects. First, to reduce emissions from deforestation and degradation forests by preventing fires, and also restoring the protecting pit forests and develop the alternative community livelihood. So actually, in the goal itself, it also considered the livelihood of the people there. And the second, for the rehabilitations and restore for the pitlands, and they will conduct it by blocking canals and the forestry. And the third is to develop a system for monitoring greenhouse gas emissions, measurement and accounting, providing data for the basic reference, and also to apply a fair and accountable payment, and it's also related with the result-based performance, and to support the research and capacity development. And for these projects, we were conducting FPAR, Feminist Participatory Action Research, that we conduct together with the women in 3 villages in central Kalimantan, in around the Kapuas River. Well, the research was already several years ago, but we think that it's still relevant because it's also still related with the conditions in central Kalimantan or in some islands in Indonesia until today. So this is some of the quotes from the woman that we interviewed. But the thing is that this project has a problems in the planning, also in implementations, and we can also still see some problems even after the projects. So for the planning, for the examples regarding the informations or participations, how women who we interviewed witnessed that there is no proper information for them, there is no involvement, usually only like several member of society who invited to involve in this project, mostly men, and actually they are not well informed about the rat itself. They only thought to plant some seeds for the examples, because the part of this project is also for the reforestations, but they have no idea for the examples about the climate change, or that what they will do is really important, for the examples, to preserve nature and etc. So in terms of informations and participation or consultations, and it's really lack of the involvement of the society, that also mentioned by Erika in the previous presentations, that it's really important to make sure that the human rights aspect in the climate projects, including in the forestry projects. But the problem is not only in the planning process, because in the implementations, for the examples, the blocking canal, because they are block the access of the women to go to the forest, in the name of to preserve the forest itself, but its impact to the women's livelihood resources. So usually women can get some vegetables that they plant there, or some of the traditional medicines from the plantations. I mean from some of the trees there, and also they usually access the fish from the rivers, but now they cannot get it anymore. I mean, when this project was happening, they cannot access the forest or other river and other resources, and it's also impact to their daily livelihood, and of course it's giving more burden to women, especially because of women also have by the social constructions, they have the responsibility to make sure that the food and also the livelihood of the family will come every day. And the other thing is because of one of the project is also like planting seeds, and women were also placed as a laborers because they are not explained about the seeds, and most of the seeds also cannot grow in their land. And then the other things is because of this, the disbursement process is also not really transparent. It's also supported by the bad of bureaucracy or the bad of the corruptions in Indonesia, that's also still quite high, and its impact to the social conflict. And again, in this kind of situations, women also impacted deeper. And actually, the project was stop funded because of the women who involved in the FPAR finally able to conduct the advocacy and to conduct the dialogue with some like the local governments there, and then the project considered as a failed project and it's not continued. But now the women also face the project of the pitland in Central Kalimantan. So the picture is about the pipe. So it and then, but again, this project also replicate the same problems because they also do the blocking, the canal blocking for the pitland. The pictures on my on my presentations was in Palangkaraya, so it's in the city actually, but actually the pitland projects also become very massive in the village. But the fact is, even though that Central Kalimantan become the pilot project for the RAT, or even they also now continue to conducting the pitland project, but the forest fire is happening like every years in Central Kalimantan, or even in other island of Indonesia like Sumatra, and it's also impacting not only people in Indonesia but also in surrounded in the neighborhood country like Singapore, Malaysia, and many more. And the victims are mostly women and children. So we see that that the Red Plus or the pitland projects also not really solve the problems. And this is the problems. The main problems actually, it's not in the forest. It's not something that the society has to access their has to limit their access to forest, but actually in Central Kalimantan itself, there are a lot of palm oil company and also mining companies there. So actually, this is the problem of how the economic or the investment policies in Indonesia. And besides, there are also like 17 company that already sued in Central Kalimantan for the forest firing, and 9 of them already inkrah, already have legally binding decisions, but the enforcement is still weak, and even the governments also not revoke their license, even though they already prove as a perpetrator of the firings. And I think that talking about the real solutions is actually to stop the corporate and industry hegemony, because it's not only apply to Red Plus, but in Indonesia there are also several projects like hydropowers and also geothermals or palm oil that they say that the government now claim it's also for the biofuel, but the fact is it's also impacting the environment and also the people around the projects, and it's also giving the bad impact. Actually, the communities already have some initiative, for example, to use the solar panel, but of course, when we are talking about the energy to fulfill the needs of the society, we can fulfill it by ourselves. But when we are talking about the industry needs, then they will the government will, or the government orientations will be on the big projects of the energy that's really harm for the people. And this is some recommendations. I think because of the time also very limited, and I know that we still want to hear the next presentations and also maybe questions and answers, but you can read it. But I'm totally agree with Erika that said that there has to be community-based solutions when we are talking about the real solutions, including talking about the GCF, also to seek opportunity how the community can access the GCF, because from what I know, it's mostly the accredited institutions is going to the international finance institutions or the big institutions, and we need to think about how the community can access it more. I think I will stop here, and hopefully it can contribute some of the knowledge for the next COP. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dinda, for showing us very concretely, specifically what the forestry projects can actually do on the ground and how they can harm actually women's rights and also community activities. I hope all of you on the webinar will have maybe another we'll have maybe 10 minutes more to also hear more about the Gender Action Plan, and then also have a wrap up and possibly answer also 1 or 2 questions that are in the end. To not consume any more time, I would directly like to hand over to Isadora. Isadora, it's yours.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation and for the previous presentations that were very interesting. So I'm going to speak quickly about the Gender Action Plan, and also give some ideas on how to connect this plan, which is at the international level, to the local level. So I am going to start by giving you a brief introduction on the Gender Action Plan at the Unfccc. So the Gender Action Plan has been mandated under the Lima Work Program on Gender, which was adopted in 2014 at COP20. And the Gender Action Plan was adopted in 2017 for a mandate of 2 years, and which is now completing the time of this first term of the Gender Action Plan. And it means that there's been a review process which was started in the beginning of this year, where the stakeholders of the convention, the parties and non-party members that have been contributing to the discussion and the review on what has been working on what needs to be improved, or on what needs to be included on this new Gender Action Plan that is being discussed now. And just to give you a little bit more about the concept on what is the Gender Action Plan and the work program on gender. So the action plan created under the Lima Work Program seeks to advance women's full, equal and meaningful participation and promote gender responsive climate policy and the mainstreaming of a gender perspective in the implementation of the convention and the work of parties, the Secretariat, United Nations entities and all stakeholders at all levels. And the action plan is more or less the operationalization of the principles, the evidence that are set out in the work program on gender. Currently, the Gender Action Plan has 5 priority areas, including capacity building, knowledge sharing and communication, gender balance, participation and women's leadership, coherence, gender responsive implementation and means of implementation, and monitoring and reporting. And this is more or less how the plan looks like. Under each priority area, you can see some activities, and for each activity there are responsible actors. There is a timeline. There are also deliverables which are assigned for these activities. So this is the current structure of the Gender Action Plan on each of the priority areas presented, and so you can have more or less an idea of how it looks like and how the action is structured. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the recommendations that have been presented to this review process that I commented, which is started this year and which has been compiled by the Secretariat on many reports by now. And so here I present only some of the recommendations that I found more interesting for the discussion on the connection of the Gender Action Plan with the local level. And the recommendations they are regarding what has been working well, on what has a need to be enhanced in the next term of the Gender Action Plan, and what also can be integrated or what has been missing in this previous phase. So there is the expectation that the next action plan will have an extended time frame, which means will be longer than a 2-year action plan. That's what we had so far. The expectation is that the next action plan will be for 5 years, and it will come together with a Lima work program, with the program on gender. And also there is the expectation that the priority areas will be rearranged in a way that they have a more action-oriented and target-oriented approach. This is because, as I showed you before, previously we didn't have in the structure of the plan measurable targets or a clear way to see how we could measure progress throughout the years. And now that the expectation is that we will have a longer action plan, there's also the need that we should follow up with clear targets and indicators what is being included under the activities. Also, there is one of the recommendations that were compiled in some of the reports is that there is the inclusion of the level of implementation in the structure of the action plan. And this would mean saying, for example, if the activity should be implemented at global, regional, or national level. There's also a lot on the need for increased technical and financial support for implementing gender responsive nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans, for reinforcement of the role of the national gender and climate change focal points, which are key people in connecting the international level to the national level. So the parties have to appoint each one focal point on gender and climate change to the convention. And so far, only 55 parties have appointed, and there is a need for reinforcement of the role, but also the capacities of this focal points and also the mandates of these focal points. Also what Tara said in her presentation, the need for more capacity building and funding opportunities and leadership of women on the ground, grassroots women's organizations, and the showcasing of their climate solutions is something that has been very strengthened in this review process by many submissions and recommendations. So, and lastly, there is the suggestion that there is need for a strengthened coherence, not only within the convention among the constituted bodies of the convention, but also with other UN agencies and policy frameworks that are international policy frameworks like the SDGs or Sendai framework, but also a coherence which is like more vertical with national policies on climate change and subnational policies on climate change. So all these aspects are somehow reflected in the recommendations being compiled and discussed by in this since the beginning of the review process. And just to conclude my presentation, I drew some ideas on how the gap could be implemented and at the local level, and how we could also advocate for the gap at the local level, drawing, of course, on all on what is already in place in the Gender Action Plan, but also on the new suggestions and the way forward that we are seeing that we are expecting for the next Gender Action Plan. So some of these points I would like to share with you. So these are means that are reflected on the GAP, and so by implementing them in the local level, we are somehow also implementing we can somehow say that it is reflected on the GAP. So for example, the appointment of the national gender and climate change focal points, as I said before, is an important agenda that parties should prioritize. Also, the building of capacities, of course, of local decision makers and civil society that work with related agendas on gender and climate change. Also, by integrating gender into local climate plans and policies, this is a means to implement the provisions of the Gender Action Plan. Also by promoting knowledge sharing through events or online platforms at the local level, and promoting the capacity building of indigenous peoples and local communities on gender and climate change. And of course, on what refers to participation of women and marginalized groups, there should be a full, equal, and meaningful participation of these groups in, for example, national consultations on the NDC's implementations and review processes in each country. So these are some ideas for how to implement the GAP provisions at the local level. And lastly, these are some ideas on how to advocate the GAP at the local level, departing from a civil society perspective, which is where I speak from, and most of us speak from here. So we can demand from governments, for example, and other relevant stakeholders to support travel funds, to give support to travel funds and capacity building of women and marginalized groups on to understand more the UNFCCC process and to be able to participate on the process. Also by demanding, as Tara said and also Dinda said before, simplified procedures to access climate finance for grassroots women's organizations and indigenous peoples and local communities is a really important way for making the GAP actions reality and more accessible to these communities and to this, for example, indigenous peoples, women's indigenous peoples. Also, calling upon governments and financial services to earmark budgets and funds for gender responsive climate action is another way to advocate for the GAP at the local level. And we can, of course, also demand that the governments and statistics office have more sensitive sex disaggregated data on climate related indicators. I don't know is there anyone wanting to speak? I can hear something, but okay, I'll just finalize now. And lastly, by demanding gender balance in the national delegations to the UNFCCC so that our countries, our regions go to the international level with at least a gender balanced delegation, and that also at the subnational and national level, the governance mechanisms on climate change have gender balance. So these are some ideas which are reflected on the GAP and also on this recommendations that have been compiled, and also the recommendations that the Women and Gender Constituency has been putting forward since the review process started, that I wanted to share with you. And I would be happy to hear from people here at the webinar other ways that you have been advocating or implementing the GAP at that local level. So that's it, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Isadora. And yeah, I think it was a really good insight on how we can not only advocate for a very comprehensive and strong gender action plan during the COP, but really also utilize it on the national and subnational level. Thank you so much for that. As we are running out of time, I would really like to take the opportunity only for those who are actually at the COP to give some small clues on how you can either getting involved with the Women and Gender constituency or the Human Rights Working Group, or both in best case, and also how to follow the topics that we have just presented actually during the climate negotiations if you are participating in Madrid. Concerning the discussion, I would just invite you to actually directly contact our speakers and yeah, just grab them during the climate conference if you are attending, because they will all be present there for I think almost all 2 weeks, except unfortunately Dinda, who had visa issues due to the relocation of the COP, and yeah, I'm afraid that several local activists will or had the same issues because of the very limited time that there was there for the new application for the Schengen visas. And I very much hope that we get the inputs from local activists who were not able to join the COP, that we can put forward the demands on the side of those who are able to participate in the 4th climate conference that is actually taking place in the European Union within the last 5 years. So yeah, just to remind about that. So very quickly, I would just like to show you where you can find the topics that we were just referring to in the climate conference. On the gender action plan and the Lima work program, there's actually a lot going on. So there will be even a pre-sessional meeting that also observer organizations are allowed to attend on the 28th of November. And then there will be the negotiation of the Lima work program and the gender action plan under the SBI agenda item 17. So if you are looking out for those topics, then you have to check the daily schedule for those agenda items. On the finances, I think I might have missed one topic. There will be the report on the GCF under COP agenda item 8, but Tara also reminded us that there is the negotiations of the guidance of operating entities, so this is also something that you can check out. And then the report of the GCF is actually also informing other agenda topics, such as, for example, the national adaptation plans. So this is, of course, also an important view on how it feeds into other issues and areas. And then last but not least, the COP will be probably all about the Article 6 measures, so cooperative approaches within the Paris Agreement. And yeah, as it was not finalized during the last climate conference in Katowice, the negotiations will very much focus on closing that, the negotiations on that article now. And we will probably hear a lot about it, and it's negotiated under the subster and agenda item 12. So this is what you have to look out for if you are interested, for example, in forestry issues, but also in particular if you are looking at market mechanisms. Although Article 6.8 is also referring to non-market mechanisms that should be balanced in comparison to market mechanisms putting forward through the Paris Agreement. And last but not least, there are, of course, a great number of various side events and exhibits where you can meet up with us or also get more information about the topics that we were just speaking about. And just in regards to how to get in touch with us, there are at least 2 lists that you can be joining, which are the WGC Advocacy List and the Human Rights Working Group. And yeah, I would encourage you to get back, for example, to me, and I will guide you through how to get on those lists. And then there will be also a couple of meetings during the COP. For example, the members of the Men and Gender constituency have daily morning meetings to strategize, though they are close to members of the constituency. But we also have afterwards a daily women's caucus that everyone is able to attend who is interested in human rights issues and also in gender justice issues. And then there will be also regular human rights working group meetings, usually taking place around noon. And as soon as you are on the mailing list, you will be regularly informed about it. So at that point, I haven't seen any questions indeed. So I'm afraid that every one of you is very busy. It's a Friday afternoon in Europe and either very late in Asia or you're just starting your day in the US and Latin America. So I just hope that we will be able to get in touch. We will send around the recording of this webinar to all those who have registered or come back to me. And in the last minute, I would really like to take the chance to say thank you again to all our great presenters who are definitely all approachable if you have more questions or you just take the time during COP. Thank you so much for joining and hopefully see you next week.